Hi folks, Wooden Boat Dan here. Just wanted to give you a heads up. The podcast you're about to listen to was recorded several years ago, so some of the phone numbers, email addresses, website links, and time-sensitive information are no longer valid. Please keep that in mind as you listen. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is woodenboatdan@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Hooked on Wooden Boats weekly podcast episode number 69. I'm your host, Dan Matson, aka Wooden Boat Dan. If you can't do it, nobody can, although many have tried. And this is the world's first podcast fully dedicated to celebrating the art, craft, history, tradition, romance, and general good time you can have with a wooden vessel. Welcome to the show today, folks. Good to have you. If you're tuning in for the first time, welcome. I think you're going to enjoy it. And for those repeat visitors, great to have you back again. And happy 2013. This is actually the first show I have recorded in 2013, so that's pretty excited. Number 69. Today's featured segment is an interview with Nat Howe, also goes by Nathaniel. Nathaniel is the vessel manager for the Northwest Seaport in Seattle, Washington. I met Nat a couple weeks ago down at his place of work, which actually that day was the tugboat Arthur Foss. They were doing some work on that. It's a tugboat that was built in the late 1800s, really sweet boat. Had a really fun interview with Nat that day, so I would encourage you to stick around for that. He's got some really cool stories about his time in Europe and fun projects he's worked on and so on. So hang around for a few minutes and we'll start that interview. Here in Washington, it's about 43 degrees where I'm at, which is Burlington, Washington right now, and rainy, which is fairly typical for this time of year. However, the days are getting longer as far as daylight goes each day now since December 21st, so that's pretty cool. We're gaining a few minutes a day, and I'm looking forward to March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, which are kind of more my favorite months of the year because it's a little easier to get out and do some things. I'm recording this in my pickup on my lunch break. Sometimes you got to get stuff done during your lunch break, otherwise it falls through the cracks. Make the best of every available moment, so you may hear some stuff in the background, rain or trucks going by or whatever. Yep, you got to do it when you can. Okay, on the weekly canoe update on my 12-foot lap strake canoe, I've got three coats of paint on the hull now, and I turned the boat over and made the thwart, which will basically stiffens the width of the boat. It attaches to the underside of the innels. I think that's how you pronounce it, innels and outles, and they're all part of the gunnels, I think. I'm learning a few things, okay, but I don't always get it right either, so call and correct me if I'm wrong or email me. Anyway, the thwart attaches to the underside of the boat, of the innels, and I made it in an hourglass shape out of, I took a piece of mahogany 3/4 by 2.5, ripped it down the middle, and added a 1/4 inch strip of Purple Heart right down the center. And then I carved out an hourglass shape, or I cut out an hourglass shape on the thwart and sanded it all down. It looks real pretty. So now I've got the thwart done. That took me about an hour and a half. And I'm thinking I'm into the boat about 110 hours right now. I've got it written down. I think I'm pretty close to 110. So once I get that thwart installed, then I will go back and put, actually what I'll do is I'll sand the inside of the boat, the epoxy, to prepare it for varnish. Then I'll turn the boat over and do one more sanding, wet sanding with 300 paper, and put my final coat on the hull of paint, Interlux Bright Sides paint. And then I'll go back and do my varnish, and then I'll be done. So I'm getting there, folks. It's good to talk about it on the show. It keeps me accountable for doing something. Moving on now to the Scamp sailboat. Scamp is the Small Craft Advisor magazine project, 11-foot, 11-inch micro cruising sailboat. And I've mentioned the boat a lot over the last 8 months, and mentioned the fact that I want to build one this year. I had planned on going to a Camp Scamp, which is a 2-week intensive course in Port Townsend, actually in other places too, where you go in with the kit and you get probably 70% of the boat done over a 2-week period. So I had planned to do that either in March or August of this year. However, time and resources and so on are not going to allow me to do that. So I've come up with what I think is a good alternative plan. I'm going to get a set of plans and the building manual from Josh Colvin at Small Craft Advisor magazine. And then I'm going to buy the kit. And I'm hoping my son Josh will go in halves on that kit because he'd kind of like to help me build the boat. So Josh, if you're listening, get your wallet out, dude. The kit's $2,300, so that would be $1,150 for each of us. And then I figure with about $500 or $600 worth of epoxy and a few supplies, we would have enough material and supplies to probably spend, 100 to 200 hours on the boat getting the hull built and the cabin on and things like that. So we could get a huge part of it done this year. So even though I had really looked forward to going to the Scamp Camp, I think this is going to be a home build project for Josh and I, if Josh joins me. And so that'll be okay. And actually what I will do is during the Scamp Camps in Port Townsend, I will go visit for a day and do some interviews and hang out and get some tips and tricks from my buddies there. So that'll be fun. So I'm really getting excited about this project. Wow. This is going to be fun. It's an awesome boat. If you haven't checked it out, you got to do so. Go to Small Craft Advisor magazine's webpage, smallcraftadvisor.com, and there's some information there. If you go to my website, hookedonwoodenboats.com, I've done some interviews about the Scamp with the designer and with Josh, who came up with the idea. As I mentioned last week, I have an all-new feature on my website, which I'm really excited about. I think it'll help people navigate my site and figure out what's there in terms of the various episodes and what the content is. If you go to my hookedonwoodenboats.com, you go to the index, click on index at the top. There's a table there of all the episodes, episode number, who's in the episode, and what it's about. And if you scroll through that, you can pick the ones you want to listen to and then just click on the hyperlink, which is the episode number, and it'll take you right to that page to see the pictures, read the show notes, or listen to the podcast from your computer. So I would encourage you to check out that index if you haven't already done so. It's a real quick way to see who I've interviewed, what the shows are about, and so on. And pass the word about that because I'm really excited. I thought about that for 6 months and finally figured out how to do it. So that is a cool addition for 2013, and it was on my list of goals for this year, and I've already accomplished it as of January 8th, so that's pretty cool. So that's the update on the Scamp. 99% chance I will buy the kit this year and get that thing rolling, and I am super excited about that. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that as I get into the project a little further. Next week, on Friday the 18th, I'm going to be going over to Bainbridge Island, which is directly across Puget Sound to the west of Seattle. My friend Wendy Hinman has given me some leads over there for some interviews, so I'm pretty excited about that. There's actually quite a bit happening on that island with wooden boats, and I'm going to be interviewing some folks there, so I'm pretty excited about that little mini trip. So here's something cool that happened for Christmas. My son Josh, who's got a sailboat himself, he's got a 27-foot Catalina, and actually is going to sell that. He wants to downsize to the Scamp with me. But anyway, he bought me at a thrift store Howard Chappell's boat building book. It's called Boat Building, a Complete Handbook. I forgot to look at the date on the book, but I'm guessing it was written in the 60s or 70s, something like that, maybe the 50s. So I opened this book up, and inside of it is a couple artifact items. One is a schedule for the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival. It was obviously done on a typewriter. The costs were so low, Anyway, this looks like a program that was made for the show probably in the 70s. I think the festival started in 76. It didn't have a year in it, but it's September 8th, 9th, and 10th. Well, since I'm kind of an Excel guy, if I go into Excel and figure out what year was it that September 8th was a Friday in the 1970s, well, if you go in and do your little formula in Excel, you can figure out that 1979, September 8th was a Friday. So I'm thinking this little program is from 1979. It's all typewritten. It's like $6 to attend the festival for 3 days. Camping is like $11 plus, $5 for meals for the weekend. They've got people presenting such as John Gardner and some other folks who I don't remember right now, but it's really a cool little artifact. So I think what I'm going to do, if I can get a decent picture of that, I'm going to put it up on the website just for fun, because I believe it is the program for the 4th Wooden Boat Festival. And I'm going to try to confirm that with somebody in Port Townsend, maybe Carol Haase, Jake Beatty, Brian Toss, one of those people. So that was really fun. Okay, new subscribers to the podcast e-newsletter this week are Brian Kirby, David Swain, and Mark Mobus. Thanks, guys, for subscribing to my e-newsletter. If you haven't done so, please subscribe by going to hookedonwoodenboats.com/subscribe. Give me your name and email. Once a month, I send out a newsletter talking about some fun stuff that's happening with Hooked on Wooden Boats. I share video links and other cool stuff. It's just a great way for me to connect with people that are interested in this podcast. So I would encourage you to do that when you get a chance. This week's Wooden Boat Hack of the Week, it's hack number 12, is a very simple one. If you're using bronze fasteners to fasten your boat, which you would typically do with a traditional boat building method where you're attaching your planks to your frames or whatever, and by the way, you do use bronze screws, not brass, because brass will corrode. But when you pre-drill for your brass fasteners, it's a good idea to wax the fasteners also. When you put them in, they go in nice and smoothly. It just makes the job a little easier. And I was in a boat shop 2 or 3 months ago. It was actually at the Gig Harbor Eden Boat Shop. And I looked over on the bench, and here is a wax toilet ring, which I'm familiar with because I've installed a few toilets over my career. And in that wax toilet ring were a bunch of bronze screws. I'm like, Tom, this is Tom Reagan from Great View Boat Works. Like, Tom, really? You guys are using the wax ring? Oh, yeah. You stick the bronze screw in the toilet ring, and you pull it out, and it's got wax on it. And not only does it make the screw go in a little easier, but it's got an antifungal agent on it, which will help prohibit not moss. Hopefully your boat isn't getting a whole lot of moss, but it'll help prevent fungus and algae and that stuff from growing on the screw or around the screw. So a wax ring costs probably $2 or $3 at the hardware store. You just plop it on your bench, stick your screws in, and you're good to go. So I think that is an awesome thing to know. It's just one of those little tips that can make a difference and make your job easier. So that is the Wooden Boat Hack of the Week. Okay, we're going to move on to the interview with Nat Howe of Northwest Seaport. Hope you enjoy this. Nat, take it away. It is December 7th, 2012. I am in Seattle with Nat Howe. Nat, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks.
Yeah, good to have you here. We're sitting on the Arthur Foss tugboat, which was built in 1889. And they're doing some refurbishing on the boat, so you're going to hear some hammers and things in the background. And it's part of the ambiance, right? Yeah. So Nat, where are you from?
I grew up here in the Seattle area.
Okay.
I work in the waterfront quite a bit with the museum ships and grew up sailing around here. So
did you? Yeah.
On the water is my orientation around here.
So what kind of sailing did your family do some boating when you were a kid?
Yeah, we have a little 30-foot sailboat that we sail up and down the coast up into British Columbia. I've been doing that since I was a little kid.
Oh, your folks still have the boat?
They do, and in fact, it used to be my grandparents' boat, and they sailed it in the Great Lakes for 20 years, and then we...
Is it a wooden boat?
No, it's just fiberglass, very first generation fiberglass.
Yeah.
So it has the lines of a wooden boat and a lot of woodwork on it.
Yeah.
But it's a glass boat, and it's built like a tank. But it's a
wow.
great little Allied Seawind 30, the same boat that Walter Cronkite had, and its sister hull was the first glass boat around the world. Very, very seaworthy for a 30-footer. Just a great boat to sail, but a great way to get out on the water and as a little kid going up the inside passage and seeing tugs and barges everywhere and freighters coming and going and log booms and seeing such a huge variety of different types of vessels. And that's just something we have around here. It's amazing. Or even right here on Lake Union, where Arthur Foss is, it's an amazing diversity of craft here. Mm-hmm. Right in the heart of the city, of course, you have a lot of yachts, but there's also 2 major shipyards on the lake. Center for Wooden Boats. We have the historic ship's wharf and all its craft here. It's a neat mix of the private yachtsmen and the commercial industries here. You get a great mix of boats.
Yeah.
So it's very inspiring.
Let's back up a little bit to your youth here. So you grew up in the Seattle area, and you guys had this 30-foot sailboat that your grandparents had. So you did a lot of sailing up in the San Juans and up to Alaska on the Inside Passage.
Never quite made it to Alaska, but we did go around Vancouver Island.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, so that's blue water sailing. You get on the outside of Vancouver Island, right?
That's great. Best wind you can find around here.
Really? Yeah. And your parents still have that boat?
Yeah. We still sail there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you do after high school then? Yeah. Did you go to college?
I went to the Midwest actually. I grew up. I guess I should back up to when I discovered the ships down here on Lake Union when I was about 10 years old. And I discovered the schooner Wawona and the tugboat Arthur Foss. And I was already into building my own toys because the toy companies were not meeting my needs as far as toy boat production. So I started with milk cartons and scissors and tape and putting those together, and eventually started building in wood and even some paper mache boats.
Model boats? Or?
Yeah, all models. And I would sail them in Lake Washington. And so I built a model based on Wawona. It was about 5 feet long when I was 11 years old. Got really hooked on that.
And Wawona, tell us just real briefly what that is.
The schooner Wawona was a huge 3-masted schooner, 400 tons. It was built in Northern California in 1897 and was tied up at the south end of Lake Union from 1980 to 2009. And it's a ship I ended up working on during its final days. And it was really the focal point for me, of all my life's ambitions have been centered around that ship and the legacy of that ship and how it represents the West Coast and maritime heritage around here. Such that I still wear my Wawona belt buckle every day and have for several years. So I got hooked on, when I met the ship, it was the tall ship in Seattle. And as a 10-year-old kid, that was absolutely amazing. So discovered that, and then discovered the Arthur Foss at the same time. Ended up doing a radio control model of the Arthur Foss, which I still have. And
you built that all yourself?
Oh yeah, they're all scratch-built boats. And so somewhere around in high school, I still remember the morning sitting in class at 8:39 in the morning. The teacher was droning on about something that I wasn't clued into, and I was thinking that there needs to be a real maritime museum in Seattle, and Wawona and Arthur Foss and these other vessels would form such a great centerpiece to that. That would be the icon in the middle. And so I think it was that morning I decided that's what I wanted to do.
How old were you?
I was 17 at the time. So it just kind of clicked for me. And then, of course, the next year I was looking at colleges, and I found a little college in Wisconsin called Beloit College, which offered museum studies for undergraduates. And most schools only offer museum studies as a graduate program. There aren't that many. Actually, University of Washington has one of the best graduate programs in museum studies. But I wanted to get on a fast track and get to this as fast as I could, so I went to the Midwest, which a lot of people tease me about because I love boats so much, and yet I went to corn country. And spent a couple years in Wisconsin, and that was fabulous education there. And then I took a semester away from there and studied with Williams College at Mystic Seaport. And so I lived on the grounds of the museum, and we took formal courses in literature and marine sciences and maritime history. We would also learn certain skills like celestial navigation, sea shanties, and working in the seaport, doing sail demonstrations for the public, and so on.
And where is Mystic Seaport, for those who don't know?
Mystic Seaport is in Mystic, Connecticut, and it's one of the premier maritime museums in the world. It's 17 acres of an 1870s seaport town. Buildings have been brought in from all over the East Coast, historic buildings, and set up on the site to recreate this seaport town. And it's got three major historic ships there, including the last wooden whaling ship, the Charles W. Morgan, which is undergoing a major restoration right now. It's an amazing project to look at. And so that was a huge inspiration for me, what was possible in maritime museums.
You spent a semester back there.
Yeah, so I lived there in a house on the grounds.
Cool. That must have been amazing.
Yeah, we knew when the guys showed up for work in the forge in the morning because you smell the coal smoke as they lit off the fires and the steamboat whistling, and it was absolute joy to be there. And it was a wonderful mix of intensive academic study on maritime subjects and mixed with just this kind of living in a postcard kind of atmosphere. So I did that, and then after college I got a Fulbright to go and study in Sweden at the Vasa Museum,
really?
Which is sort of the ultimate premier in maritime museums worldwide, a massive project. The Vasa was a Swedish galleon of 1628, double gun deck galleon that sank 15 minutes into its maiden voyage, and then was rediscovered in the 1950s and raised. It was beautifully preserved on the harbor bottom there. At very low salinity, low temperatures. Wood boring organisms don't survive in such brackish water, and so the ship was really well preserved, including the 700 sculptures that decorated it. They had all fell off into the mud and were preserved around the ship.
When was she raised?
The vessel came up in 1961, and the first 20 years was focused on reassembling the pieces back together, lining up the nail holes in every detail, and then also doing chemical treatments on the wood with polyethylene glycol to keep it from collapsing, because waterlogged wood will completely collapse on itself if you dry it out. As water evaporates from the cells, the wood cells themselves will collapse. And so for 20 years I did that, and then started the research phase. We're really only digging into the research of what Vasa has to teach now. As an archaeological object, it's an amazing resource. So I spent 2 years in Stockholm, Sweden, working on Vasa and studying the ship, the way it's displayed, the way it's supported, and particularly studying the archaeology of its rigging gun tackle blocks and the history of block technology, which goes back about 2,500 years. We've been using that.
Really?
Fascinating place to work, and just mind-blowing to walk. You walk into this huge, dark, dimly lit exhibit hall that has a 1,200-ton galleon sitting there, and all the wood is turned a deep brown black almost. And
what length is that vessel?
She's let's see, I think she's a little over 50 meters out to the bowsprit, so enormous vessel.
Yeah,
She dwarfs any of the historic ships we have here.
and she was a gunship.
Yeah, double gun deck galleon, and at the time was the most powerful warship in the world. Doing 2 full gun decks was really extremely experimental in the 1620s. Most ships were only a single gun deck, but the king wanted an extremely powerful vessel to represent Sweden, and the king was actually conquering most of the Baltic region at that time, and he was lining up to attack Poland next, and ordered these ostentatious ships to be built. And Vasa was the first of them, and unfortunately was not loaded properly as she headed out of the harbor on her maiden voyage. She caught a gust of wind, heeled over, flooded through the gun ports, and sank just 15 minutes out from the palace, right in the center of the harbor. And she went down at about 100 feet, and the water was about 140 feet deep, so it was about 75 feet. She went down at about 100 feet, and the ship's about 140 feet high. So the upper part of the rig was still sticking out of the water with all the banners and the sails and everything was all visible there. So,
oh my goodness!
Fortunately, the king wasn't there to see it. He was waiting in Poland with his troops, waiting for the new ship. And now this is the focal point in Sweden that everybody goes to see. It gets over 1 million visitors a year now.
Really? That's in Stockholm?
In Stockholm, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's the star attraction in Stockholm, along with the palace and Skansen, the outdoor museum.
Built in 1645?
1628.
1628, yeah. So how did you end up getting that stint over there then?
I simply wrote a letter saying, can I come study at your museum for a year and a half and see how these things work? And I'm getting a Fulbright grant to fund it. And they said, sure, come on over. And so I ended up working with the head of research there, Dr. Fred Hawker, who's an American, who had actually been at the same program I was in at Mystic Seaport 20 years earlier. And so the maritime world very quickly becomes a small world, especially the maritime museum world. You quickly find you know everybody and you cross paths with people quite regularly, which is part of the fun of it. It is a small group, and there's so much information to draw on. And Vasa, working at the Vasa Museum was part of what was so fun about being there was that it's such a mecca for the maritime museum and nautical archaeology fields that you have all these great, very knowledgeable people coming through, paying visits to talk with researchers there, to come and look at details of the ship. And so it becomes a focal point for the whole field, and people are coming through, and boy, every coffee break you're meeting someone else new that you'll end up knowing for the rest of your career over there.
Wow.
So it was a fabulous place to work. Yeah, so I ended up working with a rope maker there, one of the last hand rope makers in Europe, and ended up living with him in Denmark for a while and helping him make rigging for Viking ship replicas. And a sail maker there, one of the specialists for 17th century sail making, and he's actually from Ketchikan, Alaska. And he was over there in Sweden working. And so we had it's just a great focal point to be and to meet all these specialists and see how they work.
Because there's a museum in Denmark, is there, with Viking boats?
There's a couple of them, But the big one is in Roskilde, where they found 5 Viking vessels that were sunk as a blockade across the channel entrance. And those have been raised, and then replicas have been built of those and sailed. I went on some of the training cruises for those, and they were astounding. It's one of the big one, Hauhengston, which is a 100-footer. When I looked at the dendrochronological samples from it, I could see the growth rings in the wood matched the growth patterns that were happening around Dublin, Ireland in about, I think it was around 1040. And so then they realized that this vessel was actually built in Ireland and sailed to Denmark. And at the end of its service life, they sank it as a blockade. And so in 2007, the Roskilde Viking Ships Museum sailed their replica back to Ireland. And so I got to go on one of the training cruises for that, and it was astounding how well those vessels sail.
Really?
Almost no wind, and you're making 3 or 4 knots, just gliding through the water.
Now, do they row those boats also?
Yes, and I found that is incredibly unpleasant because the thwarts are only about 4 inches wide. So it's like sitting on a fence rail while you're rowing, and that begins to cut into your backside after a little bit.
Oh my goodness!
But they glide right along. They're impressive ships.
Yeah.
So I was over there for a couple of years and then came back from Sweden back to Seattle. And at that point, I felt I'd gathered enough training and experience I could come back and get back to the ship. It had been my focus since I was 17. I've been focused on Wawona for almost 10 years. And I thought now is the time. And I started working at Northwest Seaport, looking at on-land preservation options for moving the ship out of the water, because structurally it was probably not going to stay afloat too much longer. But after a couple of months of working on the vessel and we were looking at different preservation options, it became progressively more clear the ship was too far gone.
Really?
Which was kind of a blow to me because I'd spent years preparing to help out in this effort to preserve the ship, and then all that training that I gathered mostly just allowed me to see the ship was too far gone.
Oh, really?
We had major structural timbers that appeared to be sound at first, would tip over and it'd be nothing but rock inside. It's a working boat here.
Yeah, right. So the big timbers appeared to be sound, but they weren't.
Yeah, and in particular, is one of the top timbers, part of the ribs of the frame of the ship. The top timbers is the upper section. This is made out of several pieces stacked up, and the top timber comes above the deck level and supports the bulwark. These are timbers that are about 12 inches by 12 inches, enormous things. And one day I went on deck, and one had fallen over. This is a timber that's supposed to go down through the deck and in deep into the ship's internal structure, and it just tipped over on the deck one day. And it was just full of wood chips and mush and compost. It was just a shell of paint in the shape of this timber. And I started to find that throughout the ship. And in fact, the whole back end was starting to come off. All the deck planking was pulling apart. The planking on the sides of the hull had started to pop and separate along the seams. And the entire extreme end of the stern had sunk a good 10 inches or so. It was starting to hang off the back of the boat. And I went up and looked at another schooner of roughly the same vintage called La Merced, which has been beached as a breakwater in Anacortes. And I went up there, and that ship, the whole stern had finally fallen off completely. And I found that it was popping at exactly the same seams that Wawona was. So it was a fast-forward image of what was going to happen if that ship didn't sit there. And so after a lot of lengthy deliberation, we realized we couldn't save the ship. The resources were not here. Wawona's sister
ship,
ship,
was on or off the water, didn't matter.
Yeah, it just wasn't there. And of course, to save a ship of that size takes a lot of political will, a lot of political backing, a lot of funding, and you need real estate to put a ship like that on shore. And real estate in the heart of the city is almost impossible.
Yeah, right.
Something like that, especially for a small nonprofit. And we were watching the Wawona's sister ship, C.A. Thayer, down in San Francisco, was being restored by the National Park Service. Was already running over $15 million at that point, just to rebuild the ship to where it could float at the pier.
Oh, my goodness.
And so it became clear after a while that we couldn't raise the money to preserve the ship. And even if we could not raise it fast enough, because the ship would fall apart and sink before we could raise the money. And so after a lot of very, very lengthy deliberation, decided that probably the most prudent course would be to actually deconstruct the ship. And thought at least it won't sink at its moorings and have to be broken up by dredges. We could do it in a controlled fashion and then actually make a research project out of it and really map every detail of that ship.
Oh, really?
And really learn as much as we could.
Yeah.
And really, we learned more from Wawona in its last year than we had in the previous 30 years.
Really? So you took her apart piece by piece?
We took her piece by piece. So I brought in a group of students from East Carolina University's Nautical Archaeology program, where I later became a student, but brought them in to map the ship in detail in the interior. And they brought in their laser systems to map the ship and the interior, and then dug into every seam and every little hole and figured out how the whole ship was built, where the fasteners were, what the patterns were, and we found a lot of amazing things in there.
Really?
Hundreds.
Stuff you didn't expect.
Things we didn't expect, or things we had never noticed before. The entire inside of the cargo hold was just full of these little gouges everywhere that looked like marks left by shipbuilders' ads. But then we noticed they start going right across the heads of these metal fasteners. Nobody would ever put their nice ads right onto a metal fastener. And we realized it only existed in the bow and stern. There was a lot of curvature. And we figured out that it were gouges left by the lumber that was loaded during the ship's early years when it was a coastal lumber schooner. And every time you slide fresh lumber in there with a crisp edge, it would run up against the interior planking and gouge it. And all these hundreds of little marks in there. And then, are we rolling?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I think my favorite discovery we found there is the field of nautical archaeology. We try to be consistent in our measurement system. So we usually will record a ship in metric, even if the ship was not built in metric. And in the process of doing that, we discovered the most amazing details of Wawona is that it was built in hybrid measuring systems. All the timbers in the ship are standard Imperial American dimensions of 12 inches, 18 inches, and 4-inch planks. It's all in feet and inches. But then we started looking at the spacing of the timbers. Everything was laid out in metric. The frame centers were 75 centimeters apart. The scarfs were 2.25 meters long. All these nice round metric numbers.
Really?
And so we had this ship in feet and inches timber laid out on metric spacing. And this baffled us at first. I thought, this is bizarre. It's very clearly, this is the pattern of what's going on here. And then it occurred to us, well, the ship was built in California, but the builder was Danish. And everybody working in the shipyard was Scandinavian immigrants. And so suddenly this whole portion of the immigrant story in shipbuilding on the West Coast appears in the structure of the ship. And that was, of course, exactly the type of information we were hoping to find. There's things that...
Yeah.
Where the timbers here can speak. I talk about if the walls could talk, and in a wooden boat, they can. And there is a lot of stories in there. And that was just one.
Wow, that is fascinating.
So we teased out a lot of stories about the ship's past, about repairs that have been made, and things that have been altered over the years. You see damage where the ship had hit a pier in a storm and crushed one corner and had to be rebuilt. You can see repairs that were done at sea as opposed to ones that were done in a yard, what was done quickly and what was not. We found broken off drill bits still stuck through deck beams. We found a lot of neat little details in there.
Okay, we're back. Now we're on.
Now we're still fastening that plank down. So then in March of 2009, the ship was finally towed to Lake Union Dry Dock here on Lake Union. Made her last passage across the lake. And was hauled out in dry dock there, and deconstruction work actually was done there. And actually another historic vessel helped out on it, which was the Foss 300 floating steam crane, which was brought in to deliver an 88,000-pound tracked excavator, which was lowered into the dry dock and then drove underneath the ship, and then had a 120-ton crushing claw that would start chewing the back end of the ship off. And it was terrifying because that machine hit the stern of Wawona, and the whole stern just fell off into the dock. Probably 2-3 tons of material just dropped. We were just being nudged. And we knew, boy, this boat is far gone. We got here just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
And we did hit some brilliant yellow timbers in a few places that have been protected, but most of that vessel was astoundingly rotten.
Was she yellow cedar, Alaska yellow?
Which was all Douglas fir.
Oh.
Yeah. Douglas fir, the choice material for shipbuilding on the West Coast. The hardest of the softwoods. And massive dimensions. The sister keelsons are probably my favorite timber in the whole boat. They're about 2 feet wide, 1.5 feet high, and 120 feet long. Each one. One stick of wood. Just one piece of wood.
Oh my goodness.
An enormous Douglas fir that they had to... I'm still baffled how you move that around in the shipyard to get it into the ship. And it was steam donkeys, and they would float the timber in actually on the water at high tide, and then hook a cable on it and drag it through the ship, and then pound it into place. But just incredible timbers, and very, very dense growth rings, less than a millimeter per growth ring, and true old growth timber.
And she was built in San Francisco, you say?
She was built in Fairhaven up on Humboldt Bay in Northern California.
Okay.
In the 1890s, yeah.
What was she built for? What was her purpose?
Wawona was originally built as a lumber schooner in the coastal lumber trade. She is sort of, really was a superb example of the Pacific schooner design. These broad hulls that could sail south with a full load of lumber in the cargo hold and about 2/3 of the cargo on deck. Then jettison the cargo there and head back totally empty, no ballast, anything. It was broad hulls with a stout rig that would still be stable, so you could get the quickest turnaround time to come back north and load up again. And hundreds of these were built and sailed up and down the West Coast.
Yeah. Were they going between Alaska and California or Washington?
Mostly from Washington, Oregon sawmills, and they would load up there. Wawona mostly operated between Aberdeen and San Pedro. Just taking lumber down there, and there was regular deliveries. San Francisco would burn down every couple of months, so there was no shortage.
They'd bring some more old growth fir.
Right, yeah. So these schooners just kept going, and they were perfectly designed for it. They had lumber ports in the transom. You could slide lumber in the back end.
Oh, really?
You could slide right under the officers' quarters directly into the cargo hold. Very spacious open decks. How did they unload
them? That had to be difficult to unload them if they're...
They just take a cable down there and tie it onto the steam donkey and drag them back out of the ship.
What's a steam donkey?
Steam donkey is basically a small portable steam engine with a big winch head on it.
Okay.
And you can, any purpose you can come up with it. The ship had one in a little house built on deck on the midships, and you'd also have a couple at the mill and at the port, and just drag anything around you need. And if you need to move the engine, you'd use the engine to drag itself around.
Yeah.
So the donkey engine was a key part of dealing with any part of the timber industry or shipbuilding industry 100 years ago. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Wawona was in the coastal lumber trade for about 15 years. And then the steamships started to take over, and coastal north-south railroads are being put in that started to take over a lot of it. And we're finally getting into the big redwood forests of Northern California. And so a lot of the old lumber schooners were sold off, and some were burned for scrap to get the scrap metal out of them. Others were sold into other trades. But Wawona was lucky. She was one of the ones that was sold into the cod fishery in Alaska, which was just starting then.
Oh.
And it had just been discovered that there were a lot of codfish up there, particularly around the Aleutian Islands and the Slime Banks, Bristol Bay. And that was one of the major reasons that the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, because they knew there was going to be a major fishery up there. And so 35, 40 years later, when Wawona joined the cod fishery, it was just getting established. These big lumber schooners would go up to Alaska, and the crew would stay out there for 5-6 months, and they'd fish from little 1- and 2-man dories that would spread out from the ship. And it would take them 5 months to fill the ship with salted cod, and then they'd come back south. And that continued going until after World War II. Wawona sailed until 1947. And so these ships were actually never defeated by steam like other sailing ships were. The old lumber schooners that joined the cod fishery in the Bering Sea were actually defeated by diesel and refrigeration. And the shift to diesel-powered ships had refrigerators and the end of the dried salted cod. And so...
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they totally leapfrogged the steam era with these ships.
Oh, interesting.
And the last one to be fishing up there is C.A. Thayer, did her last voyage in 1950. So... It's mind-boggling. I think they were
around. Yeah, that's the one they're restoring.
They're just rebuilding it. Yes, yeah.
That's a sister ship to Wawona.
Yeah, and we actually sent them a lot of gear after Wawona was taken apart. They came up with a flatbed truck and loaded up the steering gear and a lot of rigging equipment and excess material we were able to save from Wawona. So we saved some 30 tons of material from the ship that's been distributed to different museums, including the Museum of History and Industry here that's opening right next to the Arthur Foss. Mm-hmm. It has a 60-foot sculpture made out of Wawona's hull planking, and the whole cafeteria is paneled in planking from Wawona.
Oh, cool.
And they dried it and milled it down so you get this wonderful bright wood, but around the fasteners, wherever the bolts and spikes where you see these great big rust stains that leach through the wood, make a really dramatic pattern of it.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, parts of the ship are definitely living on different places, and a few parts will actually sail again on the sister ship.
Cool. Well, that's kind of a nice ending to the story that could have been kind of rough.
Yeah, absolutely.
On everybody.
And honestly, although we're obviously sad to have lost the ship, which was the icon of our collection here, we're really proud of the process we went through and the results we had. We had a lot of input from maritime museum professionals all over the country that advised us and helped us on this, and we documented the ship in extreme detail. We can rebuild Wawona all the way down to the tool marks. We've got that data.
Is that right?
Unfortunately, we'll never find the timber for it. We'll never get another 120-foot timber to put in there, but
yeah,
we have the information. Is that a
possibility that boat would be built again?
No, I don't think so.
Really? That'd be a pretty big, expensive project.
Yeah. And actually, if you started building from the keel up a new ship, it would be about half the expense of trying to restore it at that stage, because you don't have to carefully remove all the old timbers one by one.
Yeah.
And we talked about building a replica that could be a sail trainer, but really it's the polar opposite of what you want on a sail training vessel. A sail training vessel, you want a lot of lines, a lot of rig to keep a lot of people busy. And the object of the Pacific schooner design was to have an extremely simple rig so that you would need a very, very small crew, and of course then you save on money. And these ships didn't even sail in and out of the harbor on their own. A tugboat would tow the schooners out the Strait of Juan de Fuca and get out there and let them go in a good wind, and they'd basically blow down the coast. And another tugboat would catch them on the other end and take them in.
Oh, really?
So when Wawona was sailing with lumber, she had a crew of only 6 to 7 people on board.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it has a 150-foot sailing ship. And then when it became a cod fishing schooner, suddenly you needed all these fishermen. So the deck houses were expanded. There were a whole forecastle was put in full of bunks, and suddenly there were 35, 40 people on board. It was a very different experience on the ship.
Yeah. So what year did you go to work for Northwest Seaport then?
I started with Northwest Seaport in the end of 2007.
Okay.
And worked through 2008, 2009 on the Wawona project.
Yeah.
Documenting that ship.
Okay.
And then I went back to graduate school at East Carolina University.
Oh, you did?
And got my degree in nautical archaeology there.
Okay.
Even though I'd already done a major nautical archaeology project, I thought I'd better get the background that was supposed to go with that.
Yeah. And then you came back to Northwest Seaport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've come back.
So for those listening that don't know what Northwest Seaport is, can you tell us a little bit about that, Matt?
Northwest Seaport is a small maritime heritage nonprofit organization that's been around since 1964, and we're sort of the big ship people in the maritime heritage community in Seattle. We have the large vessels, the 120-foot tugboat Arthur Foss, built in 1889, and Lightship 83, which is an offshore lightship, it's a swift shore on the side, floating lighthouse essentially. And so we are in the process of maintaining and restoring these vessels, and we run a lot of public programs on board. Everything from tugboat story time that we do with the Center for Wooden Boats. We have a bunch of 4- and 5-year-olds come on board to hear stories, on up to vocational training in engine repair. And what you can hear in the background now is a boatwright getting training from our chief shipwright and how to work with heavy timbers and how to do large vessel repair, which is quite different than small craft. To quite a range of programs.
Okay. And tell me just a little bit about the Arthur Foss history.
Yeah. The Arthur Foss has a great history. It was built in Portland in 1889.
Portland, Oregon?
Yes. So it's as old as the state of Washington. And was originally built as a tug called Wawona and operated in and out of the Columbia River, towing sailing ships over the Columbia Bar out to the ocean. And in 1898, gold is found in Alaska, and pretty much everything afloat is headed for Alaska. And Wawona was one of them. So this boat has been the Alaska Gold Rush, towing vessels north and south. Ended up on the beach a couple times in wild gales. And,
oh, really?
It's a dramatic history there. Then came back to towing in Puget Sound, mostly towing log booms after the Gold Rush. And did that until 1929 when the boat was sold to the Foss Company. And the Foss Tugboat Company immediately turned around and leased it out to MGM to make the movie Tugboat Annie, which was the blockbuster hit of 1933.
Oh, really?
It was filmed on this boat, and it looks a little different because the ship was still in its steam configuration. Because right after the movie, Foss tore the entire deckhouse structure off it, pulled out the boilers, pulled out the steam engine, installed a Washington Iron Works diesel, which we still have. So we call it the new engine, even though it's been in there 80 years. And at the time, it made Arthur the most powerful tug on the West Coast. This huge diesel engine on board, and it built a whole new house, and the vessel has the appearance that it has today. It's really from the 1930s. So the vessel then was contracted out to the armed forces, was towing supplies to Hawaii and now to Wake Island. It was actually the last boat out of Wake Island before the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked and captured the island. Arthur got out the night before the attack. The captain got nervous and scrounged some fuel from some other boats, particularly from the other Foss tug that was there, the Justine Foss, and decided to head back to Pearl Harbor. It's key that we're talking about this today, December 7th.
Yeah, right.
Pearl Harbor Day.
Yeah, isn't that something?
And this time, 71 years ago, Arthur Foss was leaving Wake Island, and the next morning the island was attacked. The crew heard about it on the radio and immediately shut off all the lights, went into radio silence, and the crew mixed all the white paint with engine oil and then painted the whole boat battleship gray. And they didn't know where the attack fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was. They didn't know if they were going to run right into them. So it was a dangerous crossing. But Arthur arrived back in Pearl Harbor to find everything on fire, and then the other Foss tug never made it out of Wake Island. So this boat had a narrow miss there.
Wow.
It was also, Arthur Foss was involved in setting up the I-90 floating bridge across Lake Washington.
Really?
Bringing the test sections in there and put it through its paces. And Arthur went full speed around it, making as big a waves as possible to test the bridge section. She rammed it, used it for all sorts of things.
Yeah, what's a top speed on this boat?
Here she runs 11, 12 knots pretty well. I haven't been on at full speed, but we've got one cabin here full of plaques and trophies from the tugboat races around Puget Sound. This boat used to do pretty well.
Yeah.
It takes a little time to build up speed, but the 700 horses will get her moving, and with the long water line
she holds.
Arthur has a capacity of 31,000 gallons of fuel. Pretty much everything below the main deck is fuel tanks, and, except for the engine. So
Yeah. So what kind of a cruising range does that give you?
Plenty enough to tow 3 barges from Seattle to out to Honolulu. So yeah, pretty much the Pacific
Thousands of miles, huh?
The Pacific is totally within a range, and it's an impressively efficient engine, even though it is the size of a school bus.
Yeah.
In fact, when the engine's idling, it's consuming less fuel than the galley stove. The diesel-fired stove will guzzle more than an idling engine in here.
Really? So, interesting. Very cool.
So Arthur Foss continued towing for the Foss Company, pulling log booms up until 1968. So this boat had an 80-year working career before it retired, and has now had...
1988, you said?
1968.
68, okay.
Yeah. So since 1970, it's been a museum ship. It's continued to be operational. In 1984, the volunteer crew took Arthur all the way to Juneau and back. So
wow.
This boat's got close to 1 million sea miles under its keel.
That's amazing. So what kind of work are you doing on her now?
So right now we have a couple major projects going. One is to stop all rainwater leaks coming into the boat, because that's what kills a boat in the Northwest. It's the rainwater coming in that feeds rot spores. Below the water line, there's no oxygen exposure, so things are quite stable there. But above the water line is where you're vulnerable. So the mallets you hear going in the background are reefing out and caulking the seams in the deck, and we're actually replacing a section of the foredeck here where it rotted out. So we pulled that up, and we have veteran shipwright Brian Johnson of Ocean Bay Marine is here. He's got 40 years of experience working with the fishing fleet and working on tugs and other vessels, and has been absolutely wonderful for teaching us how to do the repairs and teaching our volunteers and our students how to do it and restoring the boat at the same time. The other big project we have going is a systems revitalization. We have a number of systems that have conked out, like the anchor winch, and a few things that need to be rebuilt. They're 1940s technologies. And we have some wiring that needs to be replaced, 1920s, 30s, 40s wiring. Mm-hmm. So we're getting ready for a major systems overhaul, which is about $80,000 worth of work. But to get everything up and running so we can use this boat as more of a teaching platform, mm-hmm. to get the towing winch going, to have all the machinery going. Yeah. And right now we do have the generators and the main engine run, and that's a core piece of our programming, teaching people how to use these antique diesel engines. And they're very different than a modern diesel in many ways. You have to oil them by hand with a little oil can, and in fact, the engine on this boat is a direct reversing engine, which means when you want to go into reverse, you actually shut down the engine and restart it going the other direction. So it can be a little terrifying for people on the dock that are waiting to catch a dock line, because the tug's coming at them, and all of a sudden it goes silent, and it keeps coming at them. There's a little pause there.
Your timing's got to be pretty good on that stuff.
Oh, yeah. And,
as a captain,
and this boat has crunched a few docks in the years. And,
oh, man. I'd hate to be the dock.
Oh, yeah. There's this 600 tons of tugboat coming at you. It'll do some real damage. And there are some old insurance claims in the records I've come across over the years.
Really?
And usually there's a little bit of paint touch-up to do on a tug, but there's half a pier that needs to be rebuilt.
So how thick is the hull on this boat?
This boat has 4-inch hull planking on the outside. Then the timbers, the framing are about 10 inches. It's all Douglas fir hull.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then 10 inches of framing, and then another 4 inches of planking on the inside. So
inside the framing, there's 4
the
inches
ceiling
of
strakes and the interior planking as well.
Really?
So we're looking at 18 to 20 inches thick on the hull.
So that leaves cavities between the frames, between the interior and exterior planking?
Right. There are some air spaces in there, but they're not big. The framing is pretty tightly packed in this vessel.
Really?
So it's pretty much solid timber.
Now, Doug fir isn't super rot resistant, though, right?
No,
compared
it's
to
only
some other species of
Douglas fir is only moderately rot resistant.
Yeah.
The big thing was that oak was not available here, which of course is the preferred timber for large ships in the Atlantic world.
Yeah.
And when shipbuilders first came out here and saw the need for ships, mostly for lumber ships, to carry lumber down to the gold fields in California, Douglas fir was the best thing available. And it is a good shipbuilding wood. A lot of vessels keep going. The halibut schooners here in Seattle have a lot of Douglas fir in them. They're over 100 years old and still going to the Bering Sea in Bristol Bay.
Yeah.
And
You just have to stay on top of the maintenance.
You got to stay on top of the maintenance. But the big thing is it was abundant. It came in enormous dimensions, and there's just plenty of it.
Super strong stuff, right?
It's quite strong, It's good stuff.
So it's the hardest of the softwoods. That's interesting. I hadn't heard it put that way before.
Yeah, that's really the way to think about it. And that's important in shipbuilding, because if it's too soft, it'll pull the fasteners right through. You pound a spike into it, and it'll pull it right on through. So that's why cedar was not used in large vessels much. But Douglas fir would do the trick, and you can get it in any dimension you want.
Yeah.
And it's amazing looking at ships in the Atlantic world. When I worked at the Vancouver Museum or Mystic Seaport, because you get down to the heaviest timbers in the ship, and the frames, and in the bow particularly, you see it. You find these big timbers that just look like a tree that someone peeled the bark off of. It's shaped like a tree, and it's because they were trying to get the largest possible timber out of a tree. So they would just saw off the branch nubs and leave roughly a tree-shaped thing. And you'll never see that on West Coast Douglas fir ships. Everything's nice, squared, round things.
Because they're so big.
The timber is so big, you never get to the point where you run out.
Because the old-growth Doug fir trees were, 6 feet in diameter, 10 feet?
Oh, easily, yeah. They're ones that plenty of them recorded that were up 15, 20 feet thick and 300 feet tall.
Yeah.
So, there's a joke in the field of nautical archaeology that if you read all the reports on boats out there that have been dug up, it seems like there's a chronic lumber shortage everywhere. And it's sort of an easy answer when you see something that doesn't look quite logical, the timber is incomplete or something. But you'll never see that about a West Coast ship, because everything's nice squared edges. There's no appearance of taking a second-class timber into the boat. It's all great stuff, clear, straight grain, no knots, tight grain. It's impressive stuff to look at. It really fascinates me what was being done out here. And shipbuilding on the West Coast at that time was really grasped my attention, because it's shipbuilders working in an experimental material, Douglas fir, which hadn't been tried before. They're working on entirely new designs of purpose-built ships, the development of the Pacific schooner, namely. And they're on the frontier, and yet they're bringing in industrialized shipbuilding methods, steam-powered saws, air-powered drills, and so on. So there's a lot of rapid change in shipbuilding going on in the late 19th, early 20th century out here.
Yeah.
And these ships are a product of that. And
is there anybody credited with designing the Pacific schooner, coming up with the concept, or?
Not specifically. It's kind of several different builders are recognized. Hans Ben Dixon that built Wawona is one of them. The Hall brothers are operating on Bainbridge Island, their shipyard. They're recognized as being part of the creators of this design concept.
Are they still there?
No, they're long gone.
Still there. Yeah.
But you can still go to the harbor there, and you can still see remnants of the shipyard, pilings sticking out of the mud.
Really?
Parts of the old sawmill are still there.
Yeah.
It's strange going there now, because I grew up sailing in there with my parents, and it's this big open natural bay and forested, and there's some old remnants of industry there on the beach, just bits of pilings and bricks and a pile of slag from the forges, but that's about it.
Yeah.
And then you find photos from the 1890s, and it's in the middle of a huge industrial complex entirely made out of timber.
Really interesting. Yeah, very good. Well, I appreciate your time today, Nat. Any parting comments for our listeners today?
The big thing is come on down to the historic ship's wharf and see the ships. We've always got things going on, and we love to do as much of our maintenance as educational programming as possible. So you can come and learn to reef and cork and seal seams, handle timbers. We're always doing work, whether it's on the engines or on the woodworking. There's a lot to do down here. We're always looking for volunteers that are interested in learning how to do these things.
Okay, and is there admission cost to come down and look at the boats, or?
No. At present, it's open. It's free.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Nat. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks so much, Nat, for taking the time for the interview. It was really fun to come and talk to you and look at the Arthur Foss and talk about the boat building stories in Sweden and all that fun stuff. I wish the best to you and the people at the Northwest Seaport there. And I will put a link on the website to your organization. So thanks again. Next week will be an interview with Tyson Trudell of the Center for Wooden Boats. You'll want to stick around for that. Really fun time with Tyson. He's been an employee there for a while and loving what he's doing. Basically working with the youth programs there. So Tune in next week for that episode. If you'd like to support this show financially and you make purchases at Amazon, you can go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/Amazon. And if you make any purchase at that point on Amazon, I get paid a small commission. Likewise, if you buy boat building and marine supplies, Jamestown Distributors has a great selection of boat building stuff. And if you go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/JD, just the initials JD, that's a link to their site where I get paid a small commission. Also on my website, if you go to the top menu to the store tab and click on that, I have some gear on there for sale, some t-shirts, hats, mugs, flip-flops, stuff like that. If you'd like that with the Hooked on Wooden Boats logo, it's kind of fun stuff. Also, I have some friends back east who have started a video website for classic boats called Off Center Harbor. And if you go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/Off Center Harbor, that'll take you to their site. You can get a trial membership for 3 months to check out their videos and their blogs. They've got some really great stuff. At that point, if you decide to join, you get a discount for joining through Hooked on Wooden Boats, and I get paid a small commission there too. So check it out. You can always connect with me. In fact, I'd love it if you connected with me via email, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. You can leave a voicemail on my website. If you go to the homepage, hookedonwoodenboats.com, to the right is a little button that says Send Voicemail. If you click on that, you can send me a voicemail right from your computer, or you can call my voicemail feedback hotline, 424-261-2360. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. If you search for Wooden Boat Dan there, you will find me. So lots of ways to connect. I'd love to hear from you. It's great when I get feedback about the show. It keeps me motivated to keep doing this week after week. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week. Keep the sunny side up and the barnacled side down. Wooden Boat Dan over and out. We'll talk again next week. Take care.